shooters, shoot-em-ups, STGs, shooting games, shmups. People have many names for the 2D shooting game genre that gained massive popularity in the late 1970s and evolved greatly throughout the 80s. One series in particular, however, was incredibly instrumental in this evolution: Gradius. Its forward-thinking ideas, gorgeous graphics, intriguing environments, and interesting ship and enemy designs bolstered just what the genre could be and helped shape what it would become. Gradius's importance to the video game industry and its effect on many of its pioneers cannot be denied. This is its long and complex history. Our story begins in 1981, 4 years before anyone would ever hear of the name Gradius, with the release of Konami's arcade title, Scramble. Scramble was a 2D scrolling shoot-'em-up that saw its players controlling a spaceship that could fire horizontally while also dropping bombs on ground-based enemies and fuel storage containers. Colliding with the environment or any of the multiple enemies or projectiles on screen would instantly destroy the ship and lose a life. While making your way through Scramble's levels, the player also has a timer slowly ticking down, which is represented by the ship's fuel gauge. Running out of fuel is an instant loss of a life, but more can be collected by destroying the many fuel containers throughout the ship's levels. Nowadays, this premise sounds pretty simple and straightforward, but in 1981, this was a groundbreaking arcade game and would become incredibly successful for Konami. They would quickly try to capitalize on its success by releasing a spiritual sequel for the title that same year, named Super Cobra. Instead of a spaceship though, players would now control a helicopter. While Super Cobra was technically a sequel to Scramble, it shared nearly identical gameplay and was obviously a quick and cheap way for Konami to keep the quarters rolling in at the arcades. 3 years would pass with no mention of a true sequel to the game until 1984, when development began on a new title codenamed Scramble 2. Konami would put together a new arcade development team in 1984 consisting of 5 members, 2 programmers and 3 designers. This team would be headed by programmer Hiroyasu Machiguchi. When deciding on the type of game they wanted to make, the team would debate a bit before landing on their final decision, a new shoot-'em-up title. Not just any shoot-'em-up title though, one that could compete with Namco's now incredibly popular Xevious arcade game. The project would start as a true sequel to Scramble and would be referred to as Scramble 2 throughout most of its production. Coincidentally, Xevious had been created in response to Scramble's resounding success, which made this start to feel like a big ping-pong match between Namco and Konami to see who could make the better arcade shoot-'em-up game. This new team would take many of the mechanics Scramble had introduced and build on them in new and interesting ways. The initial graphical concepts for the project would start out much different from Scramble, however, as everything would have very organic designs and be based on biological creatures and anatomy. While many of these designs would be scrapped for a more traditional mechanical style found in popular sci-fi movies at the time, the team would still retain some of these ideas in the final version of the game and revisit others later down the road. One of the biggest goals the development staff had with the creation of this new project was to give it a sense of seikaiken. Seikaiken, when translated from Japanese, literally means world view, but it is used by artists and designers to refer to the creation of story, lore, and world building that exists beyond what you experience directly in a piece of media. The developers wanted this new arcade title to have more graphical depth and for its world to feel more alive and interesting than its competitors. With computer technology progressing fast and arcade boards growing in power, it had become much more feasible for the team to make their vision a reality and create beautiful environments and complex stages that had never been seen in arcade shoot-'em-up games before. The project's artists would utilize unusual designs like the Moai statues from Easter Island, large space volcanoes, and unsettling tentacle creatures to give their new game's world a sense of mystery, awe, and wonder. The other goal the team wanted to implement was a form of player choice in its gameplay. This new game shared very similar mechanics to Scramble, like horizontal 2D scrolling, intense shooting, and missile use for enemies beneath you, But they weren't satisfied with doing just the bare minimum. They initially tried to use a more standard power-up system found in many other games at the time, where the player would simply collect the items they wanted to increase their speed and gain additional weapon types, but it just wasn't very satisfying and fun. The team then tried a brand new concept, a power-up menu where players could customize their speed, weapons, and defense as they played, but in whichever order they preferred. This new system would require the player to collect only one type of power-up currency, represented by orange capsule-like items that would move the highlighted upgrade on the menu bar up one space for each capsule collected. The player's ship started off slow and relatively powerless, but it could be slowly upgraded into a force to be reckoned with. Each space had a different power-up that could be selected, including a speed boost, missiles, a double shot, a laser, a shield that absorbed damage, and an orange option. These option bubbles, sometimes referred to as multiples, would follow the path of the player's ship and mimicked each shot it took, effectively doubling its firepower up to 4 times. The shield text on the upgrade bar was oddly represented by a question mark instead of the word shield. This was because there had been plans to originally add more abilities available on that slot, but the team was strapped for time and only the shield made it to the game's final version. Each upgrade selection would require collecting a certain amount of power-up capsules. An increase in your speed only cost 1 capsule, while something more substantial like an option would cost 5. This would allow each player to create their own custom upgrade experience and try out different combinations of powering up their ship. As this new project slowly started to become its own entity and move away from simply being a sequel to Scramble, they would need a new name for it. While many of this new project's concepts and gameplay took a lot of time to design and test, its title came about much more quickly. There were already a few different ideas on the table, but a co-worker of one of the game's designers had suggested the title Gradius. It was easy to say and simple enough to remember. The name was perfect. It is often speculated that Gradius is just a mistranslation or mispronunciation of gladius, the Latin word for sword, but this has since been debunked by the original developers themselves. The title actually refers to the planet the player must protect from the game's invading antagonist, the massive Bacterian Empire. The final piece of the puzzle would be designing the player's ship itself. Early designs had it resembling a seahorse before it took on the appearance of a more traditional-looking fighter ship. The front part of the fuselage resembled a large, 2-pronged fork and gave the ship its interesting and unique look. They would name this ship the Vic Viper. Inspired by the 2 prolonged sections having a V shape, the designers would decide on Vic for the first half of the ship's name. The second half, Viper, would be named after the snake-like movement of the orange options moving behind the ship during gameplay. Later on, one of the Vic Viper's designers admitted to basing the ship's look off a spaceship from a popular sci-fi movie. While he never specified the film, many people have assumed it was Battlestar Galactica's Colonial Viper Mark VII, which lends extra credence due to the Viper part in the Vic Viper's name. While many arcade shoot-'em-ups only used a 2-button system, Gradius's arcade cabinet would be one of the first to implement 3 buttons. 1 to fire your main weapon, 1 to fire missiles, and 1 to select your choice of upgrade from the power-up bar. The final version of the game consisted of 7 different stages that ranged from a floating island of attacking Moai heads to a highly advanced interstellar base. A recurring boss called the Big Core Mark I would appear at the end of the first 5 levels, blocking the player's path until it was defeated. The 6th stage had a unique boss called the Nucleus, while the 7th's final boss was a large brain that wouldn't fight back as you slowly destroyed it. After completing the last stage, the game would continuously loop, allowing players to remain endlessly going through it even on just 1 credit. Defenseless and easy final bosses, as well as the game looping mechanic, would become commonplace features found in future titles of the series. When the game finally released in Japanese arcades in 1985, it was received incredibly well and would be considered a huge success. Players loved the beautiful graphics, the variety in level designs, the addicting gameplay, and especially the unique power-up system. It became clear very quickly that Konami and their new development team had a big hit on their hands. Gradius would receive countless ports to many platforms over the following decades, including the Famicom, NES, PC Engine, PlayStation, Nintendo Wii, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and various PC versions. Both the PC Engine and MSX ports actually included an exclusive stage not found in the arcade game called Wasteland. When Gradius finally launched overseas, it would be released under a different name entirely in both arcades and on the MSX as Nemesis. Strangely, the MSX version in Japan would also use the name Nemesis, and the North American NES version would retain the original Gradius title. After Gradius' successful arcade debut, its team began on a new chapter in the series, though it would not share the same title as its predecessor. After finishing up their first arcade hit, the Gradius team wanted to create a new title in the series. But instead of rushing into a direct sequel, they decided to try out some new ideas first in a somewhat in-between game. This new game would be called Salamander, then Life Force, and then Life Force again. Don't worry, it'll make sense soon. The first aspect they wanted to focus on was creating a game in the Gradius universe that allowed for 2 simultaneous players. This would make utilizing the power-up menu they had created much more impractical and harder to implement. The team decided to scrap this mechanic entirely and instead go with the more standard approach of simply collecting specific power-ups to upgrade your ship. Many of the weapons and barriers found in Gradius, like options, missiles, and shields, would return in this new title, as well as the now fan-favorite ship, the Vic Viper. However, the designers would create a new fighter ship that the second player would control, named Lord British. Simultaneous cooperative play wasn't the only new feature to be added, as some of the stages would now be played in a vertical scrolling format with a top-down perspective. Players would now also be able to continue right where they left off after their ship was destroyed, rather than being sent back to a certain checkpoint like in Gradius. The game was titled Salamander to differentiate it from Gradius, since it had lost one of its main defining features, the power-up menu, and added some new elements like instant continues and the vertical scrolling stages. Even with a different title though, it was still very much a part of the Gradius universe. Salamander would include 6 very unique stages, including a flesh-like organic region, a fiery inferno, and a hazardous asteroid field. These levels would feature some familiar enemies like amoebas and the Moai heads. In 1986, a year after Gradius' release, Salamander launched in both Japanese and British arcades to resounding success and applause. It would make its way to North American arcades also that same year, but with a new name and some small changes. Its title would be changed to Life Force, and rather than protecting the planet from the invading Bacterian Empire, the player would instead be tasked with invading a half-human, half-biomechanical warrior's body to destroy a tumor that was slowly killing it. Many of the levels' backgrounds would be changed to the organic web-like imagery found in Salamander's first stage to help emphasize that you are inside of a living person's body. Rather than shun the North American version, as was normally the case with these types of situations, the Japanese developers embraced it and would release Life Force in Japan the following year. This new Japanese version of Life Force was no simple port though, as the team would double down on the organic style found in the North American version and redraw many of the bosses and levels to make them fall more in line with this theme. Life Force's organic focus was also a bit ironic, as the original vision for Gradius was a very similar aesthetic, bringing everything around full circle. Not only would the game get a graphical makeover, it would also now include Gradius' power-up menu bar. Each player now had their own bar and set of upgrades they could utilize after collecting power-up capsules from downed enemies. Salamander and Life Force would receive many ports over the years to various consoles and PC platforms, but the two that really stand out are the Famicom/NES and MSX versions. In 1987, the Famicom and NES ports would be released as Salamander and Life Force respectively in their native regions. They would borrow elements from both Salamander and the Japanese version of Life Force, retaining the power-up menu bar and having a bigger focus on the organic theme. These ports would also replace some of the original game's stages and bosses with brand new ones. The MSX version of Salamander would have a lot more story and lore, and just like the NES version, it would replace some of its stages and bosses with new exclusive ones. That same year, the MSX would also receive a sequel to its first Gradius game titled Gradius 2. This Gradius 2 would not be the official sequel to the original arcade game, however, and would split off into a separate story continuity from the main series. Oddly, the first MSX game was released in Japan as Nemesis, but this version would now use the Gradius name. It would still retain its Nemesis title though for its release outside of Japan. The title had 8 separate stages, and instead of playing as the Vic Viper, players would be piloting a new ship called the Metallion. Technically though, the game has 14 levels, 6 of which are the player backtracking through previous stages in reverse order. It played very similar to the original Gradius title, but introduced a new feature where you can fly into a boss's core after they are defeated and have the opportunity to gain a new upgraded weapon in a small bonus stage. Also added were new power-up items that gave the player's ship temporary enhancements like slowing down enemies and projectiles and gaining invincibility. A few years later, the title would receive a remake for the Sharp X68000 PC platform under the name Nemesis 90 Kai. It would feature better graphics and sound, new bosses, and extra stages. Around the same time that Gradius 2 for the MSX was released, the development team at Konami would begin work on the official mainline sequel to Gradius' first arcade outing. In 1987, when work began on the official sequel to Gradius, the team would be given a hellish deadline, and the game would need to be completed in only 5 months. Thankfully, the Gradius development team had grown in size, and many people who had become fans of the original title had joined Konami as designers and programmers. This new pool of talent would lend a whole new perspective to the project and helped take the series to new heights. Just like the original game, a large focus was put on player choice and customizing how you could play the game. The power-up menu bar would remain, but instead of just one group of weapon upgrades, players could now choose between 4 different loadouts. Some of these new weapon choices would be borrowed directly from Salamander, such as the Ripple Laser and Force Field. Something else that had become notably apparent over the past few years were that Gradius' fans had started to become much more skilled at the titles. This would lead to Gradius 2's difficulty being cranked up quite a bit in relation to the first 2 games. The team would add more randomness to the enemy bullet patterns, as well as into aspects of their stage's environments. The newly added crystal stage in particular made it so each player would experience different types of patterns as the crystals in the level were broken apart, forcing people to come up with different strategies to tackle this randomness. A new enemy called an option hunter would also be added in to make players need to stay extra attentive, as it would steal the Vic Viper's options if it came into contact with them. Players would not only have to maneuver enemies, bullets, and stage hazards, but also make sure and keep their precious options safe on top of all that. Gradius 2 would be differentiated from the MSX's sequel by using a Roman numeral 2 instead of a numerical 1, and also having a subtitle that read Gopher no Yabo, translating to Gopher's Ambition in English. Gopher would act as the game's main antagonist, leading yet another Bacterian attack against the planet Gradius, and the Vic Viper once again setting out to defeat the incoming invaders. The game would consist of 8 unique stages that ranged from the fan-favorite Artificial Sun level to the H.R. Geiger-inspired pseudo-organic alien stage, which featured familiar enemies from the Contra series. Many of Gradius' staples would return for this sequel, like the attacking Moai heads, a final space fortress, a reimagined volcano stage, and its familiar big core boss. But there would also be some new additions that would stick with the series in the years to come. The first would be a boss rush stage, often referred to as a boss parade, that consisted of multiple bosses fought back to back and provided a big challenge for players unprepared for it. The majority of these bosses would be ones returning from previous games in the series, especially Salamander. The second would be a high-speed maze stage where the Vic Viper would need to maneuver through many obstacles and slopes while moving at a much faster speed than normal. The idea likely was taken from the short escape sequence at the very end of Salamander. Both of these new types of stages would continue on into almost every single subsequent Gradius game, even many of its later spin-off titles. Gradius 2 would release in early 1988 to critical acclaim, with fans applauding its new features and improvements on the series. It would release in Europe under the title Vulcan Venture, leading to plenty of confusion as none of the Gradius games that had come out in this region had any title similarities linking them together. Gradius had been renamed Nemesis, Salamander retained its original title, and Vulcan Venture had a completely new title. The game would first be ported to the Famicom that same year in 1988, but as had become the norm with many of these ports, it would have plenty of its stages altered, as well as some of its bosses removed and new ones added in. A few years later, it would receive a PC Engine CD version that would be very faithful to the arcade game and even added in an extra stage and boss called Temple and Desert Core, respectively. Gradius 2 would be ported to many other platforms over the next few decades, including the PlayStation, Nintendo Wii, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and PC platforms. Surprisingly, none of Gradius 2's various ports would officially reach North American shores until 18 years later when it was released as part of the Gradius collection for Sony's PlayStation Portable handheld console. A spin-off game for Gradius 2 would also be developed for the MSX and put out later on in 1988. It would be titled Gofuro no Yabo Episode 2. This spin-off would reuse some of Gradius 2's stages and bosses, but the majority of the game would be brand new content. Upon starting it up, players could choose which ship they wanted to pilot, similar to the 4 different power-up loadout choices found in Gradius 2's arcade version. The game also added in a choice of option behavior. This would allow players to change the options from shadowing them like in other Gradius titles, to either staying in a fixed position or having them rotate around the ship. It would also build on the weapon upgrade system found in Gradius 2's MSX version. But rather than traveling into a defeated boss's core, players would need to steer their ship into secret locations hidden throughout its various stages. Gofuro no Yabo Episode 2 would later be released in Europe as Nemesis 3 Eve of Destruction, and in South Korea as Salamander 2. By this point, the Gradius series was incredibly popular and had become a household name among video game enthusiasts. Shortly after Gradius 2 was completed, a new team at Konami would begin development on the next entry for the popular shoot-'em-up, but little did fans know that this new game was planned to be the final chapter in the Gradius series. Development on Gradius 3 began in 1988, and it was planned to be Konami's biggest shoot-'em-up yet. Internally, the project was referred to as the final Gradius game, and was meant to be a summation of the entire series and its grand finale. Its development time took about a year to complete, which was more than double that of Gradius 2's, and its lofty expectations would push its team to their utmost limits. The story sees Bacterian himself, the leader of the Bacterian Empire, attacking the planet Gradius, and the Vic Viper, as usual, being sent out to thwart the onslaught of enemies, and finally put an end to the series' lifelong antagonist. Up until now, all of the other enemies defeated in previous Gradius games had only been henchmen of Bacterian. The game's subtitle, From Legend to Myth, even offered a sense of reflection and finality. The stage was set for the story to finally reach its epic conclusion. Gradius 3 would continue to innovate on the power-up menu bar by not only offering many preset choices like its predecessor, but also introducing an edit mode that would allow players to mix and match various weapon types, though some weapons from the presets would not be available in this new mode. Additionally, there was an extra power-up slot on the menu bar represented by an exclamation point that gave players new choices, like the ability to speed down the Vic Viper or using a Mega Crush, found in-game as the blue capsules, which instantly eliminated all enemies on screen. Gradius 3 would be packed with 10 gorgeous and engaging stages, more than any in the previous games up to this point. These stages included many different themes and environments, from a space desert region and an expanse of bubbles to a fireball-filled mountain range and a botanical domain. The boss parade found in Gradius 2 would also make its triumphant return, with many familiar faces showing up to thwart the player's progress. A new pseudo-3D level was also added that utilized a third-person view behind the Vic Viper, where the ship would need to maneuver its way through many fast-moving obstacles similar to the high-speed stage in Gradius 2. There would be no enemies present, but power-up capsules would appear throughout it and could be collected. 2 secret levels were also added that allowed you to play through the opening stages of either Salamander or the first Gradius game. To access these, you'd need to get hit by one of the 2 lower attacks from the final boss, Bacterian. As had become the standard, last bosses in each Gradius game were ridiculously weak and their attacks easy to dodge, so you'd have to know about the secret going into the battle unless you just had some really bad luck. During development, the team decided to crank up the difficulty for Gradius 3 to such an extreme that the title actually became notorious for it. The developers implemented a beginner mode which tones down the difficulty a bit, but once the player reaches the end of the third stage, the game ends and tells them to try out the normal difficulty mode. In late 1989, Gradius 3 would launch exclusively in Japanese arcades and in parts of Asia, skipping both North American and European regions. The game was received well for its gorgeous graphics and tight gameplay, but some criticized it for its unfairly punishing difficulty. Gradius 3 would surprisingly only be ported to one platform shortly after its release, the Super Famicom/Super NES. This port would be considerably less difficult than the brutal arcade version and even added in some extra weapons and option formations in its edit mode. As per usual, some stages would be cut and others added into the Super NES adaptation. This version would also suffer from extreme amounts of slowdown when the screen became too crowded, though this would often help to make dealing with the countless enemies and bullets a bit easier. The arcade version would eventually be ported years later in Gradius collections for both the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation Portable, as well as being re-released decades later on the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch in late 2020. The next 2 years would see the Gradius series finally make its way to Nintendo's popular handheld console. Nemesis released in 1990 for the Game Boy and surprisingly would share the same name across all of its versions in each region. It was a pretty standard Gradius game and would reuse many of the stages and enemies found in previous titles. A stage select would be available from the start, but Nemesis in its entirety would only end up being 5 levels long, making for a very short experience. The following year, in 1991, Nemesis 2 would also release on Nintendo's handheld, and just like its predecessor, it would contain only 5 stages. The North American version would end up using the Gradius name and be titled Gradius: The Interstellar Assault. While it wasn't completely devoid of staples found throughout the series, it did lack many, including the Moai statues and a classic Gradius stage. Neither of these games were considered mainline entries and are often viewed as just quick spin-offs. After these 2 Game Boy titles, the Gradius series would go quiet for quite a few years, and many started to wonder if Gradius 3 was actually going to be the last mainline game in the series. Five years after the portable Nemesis 2, Gradius fans could finally rejoice as Salamander 2 would make its way into Japanese arcades. There had been a few spin-off titles in this time period, but nothing from the main series. Salamander 2, while not technically a brand new Gradius title, was still a reassurance to its fans that Konami had not forgotten them. This new title would utilize both 2D sprite graphics with some 3D elements mixed in. Just like the original Salamander, its direct sequel ditched the power-up menu bar in favor of a more simplistic weapon pickup system, though the team developing the game would make a few small changes to it for this title. Players could now also pick up option seeds that would constantly circle around their ship. When 2 option seeds were acquired, they would become a normal option found in the previous games. Options could now also be sacrificed in order to gain use of a short-term homing laser. Another change to the weapon system would be the ability to gain additional temporary upgrades to your normal weapons, like double shot and laser, when collecting the same weapon power-up again. The Vic Viper would return as the first player's ship, but a new one would be added for the second player. Instead of the original Salamander's Lord British, it would be replaced with a brand new Super Cobra ship, most likely a reference to Konami's 1981 spiritual sequel to Scramble. Salamander 2, just like its first title, would contain 6 different stages, with a few of its original bosses even making cameo appearances. The game would hit arcades in 1996 to a somewhat lukewarm reception. Fans and critics were happy to have the series back, but many agreed that it brought very few new ideas to the table and lacked the quality in its design found in the first game. Salamander 2 would be ported to consoles the following year as part of the Japanese exclusive Salamander Deluxe Pack Plus for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, alongside the original Salamander and the Japanese version of Life Force. A decade later, it would also see a release on the PlayStation Portable in Salamander Portable, a collection of the Salamander games and a few other Konami shoot-'em-up titles. To this day, Salamander 2 has never officially made its way outside of Japan. People wouldn't have to wait much longer for a new Gradius title, as Konami was already preparing something new for longtime fans of the series. This new entry would not be found in arcades though, but instead on home consoles. When development began on this new entry in the Gradius series, it was decided early on that it would be a console game and developed exclusively for Sony's PlayStation. Planning on the title began in 1996 after Salamander 2 and the Gradius Deluxe Pack collection had already been released in Japan. Initially, the team working on this new project had considered making it a mainline Gradius game, but later chose instead to create a spin-off title in the same vein as the Salamander series to give themselves more freedom in their design ideas. Konami had shown to be very strict with what its established mainline series could and couldn't do, which had just recently shown to work as a detriment in Salamander 2's creation. The team emphasized its separation from the mainline games by titling the game Gradius Gaiden. Gaiden is a Japanese word that literally translates into side story. This side story still resides in the Gradius universe, just like Salamander, but it takes place in the very distant future, far off from the events of the main series games. There would be 4 selectable ships available, each with their own unique set of weapons. The Vig Viper and Lord British would return from the earlier titles, and newly added were the Jade Knight and Falcon Beta. Both new ships had very interesting weapons and offered some fresh and unique types of gameplay. The Jade Knight could emit circular pulses from its center, and the Falcon Beta would leave behind small black hole-like explosions where its shots collided that stayed active a few seconds, doing damage over time. Similar to Salamander 2, weapons could be powered up a second time by selecting them again on the power-up bar, although in Gradius Gaiden, these upgrades would be permanent instead of temporary. Also introduced was the ability to rearrange your power-up menu bar when first starting the game up, which allowed players to truly customize their experience. Gradius Gaiden would be broken up into 9 separate stages. Many of the usual Gradius suspects would be found in the game, like a boss parade, a high-speed level, the murderous Moai statues, and a reimagining of the first game's classic volcano stage. This volcano stage would now slowly be getting pulled apart into a giant black hole though, which changed things up quite a bit. There would also be some other unique types of locales, like a snowy area and a ship graveyard. Not only could just one player go through these stages, but just like in Salamander, 2 people could play through them simultaneously. When the game finally hit the PlayStation in the summer of 1997, it was met with very positive impressions and reviews. Critics praised its graphics and soundtrack as well as its innovations on the previous Gradius titles. Some even went as far as comparing its fresh take on the series to another Konami side story that had been released earlier that same year, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Gradius Gaiden did not see a release outside of Japan until 9 years later, when it came bundled in the Gradius collection for the PlayStation Portable. The next year, after nearly a decade-long wait, development on a new mainline Gradius title would finally commence. In 1998, a new team at Konami was assembled to begin work on what would eventually become Gradius 4. Many had assumed Gradius 3 would be the final mainline title, but Konami had decided otherwise. Around this time in Japan, music and rhythm games were gaining massive popularity in arcades, and had slowly started to overtake and push out many other genres, shoot-'em-up games like Gradius included. The development team had a big challenge ahead of them to make Gradius a success again in the arcade, especially with the previous mainline title having been released around a decade ago by this point. At first, the developers had considered changing the gameplay drastically to something more 3D oriented, especially since they were using polygon graphics to create this title, but they eventually decided to stick with the tried and true 2D style. They would use Gradius 2 Gopher no Yabo as the game they would reference and build upon when creating this new entry. The project's director, Hiroyuki Ashida, had worked on Gradius 2 as a new hire and had a great fondness towards it as it was his favorite title in the franchise. Gradius 4 would be given the subtitle Fukatsu, which is a Japanese word meaning revival. This was not only meant to represent the mainline series' return after being dormant for many years, but also a resurrection of the more classic type of arcade shoot-'em-up games seen as bullet hell titles had begun to overtake the genre. Finally, it would also represent the return of Gopher from Gradius 2, who would be revived and make his comeback as the entry's main antagonist. This fourth game would remove the edit mode that Gradius 3 had pioneered and instead offered 6 different preset weapon loadouts, 4 of which came directly from Gradius 2, along with a choice of either a shield or force field. This was done to make it easier to keep its power-ups and upgrades more balanced. There would be 9 separate stages, although almost all of them felt like they were simply taken from the older games and retooled a bit. It did have some interesting ideas though, like plunging its volcano stage level completely into magma halfway through and combining the crystal and bubble stages from Gradius 2 and Gradius 3 into one level. The majority of the Gradius staples would return as to be expected, but seeing them now rendered in 3D polygonal graphics was a new and interesting change for the series. The title screen would also finally put an end to the debate of how Gradius was officially supposed to be pronounced. Gradius 4 would hit arcades in early 1999 to mostly positive reception, although similar to Salamander 2, the lack of innovation and new ideas were pretty apparent. The title would receive a port to the PlayStation 2 the following year, being bundled alongside the previous Gradius mainline arcade title in a collection simply called Gradius 3 and 4, and also would see release once more 6 years later in the PlayStation Portable's 2006 Gradius collection. Gradius 4 would be the final game in the series to ever see an arcade release, marking the end of an era. The next Gradius game would once again see the series returning to a Nintendo handheld. Gradius Generation would be announced for the Game Boy Advance in 2001, and marked the first time in many years since the series had made its last foray into the portable space with Nemesis 2. It would be developed by Mobile 21, a game developer that was a 50-50 joint venture between both Konami and Nintendo. Outside of Japan, it would receive 2 different names, Gradius Galaxies in North America and Gradius Advance in Europe. The title would include an intro movie that went through the various Gradius games that had been released before it. Strangely absent was 1996's Salamander 2. Konami's arcade hit Scramble would be present, however, being the first title shown and making fans question if it was actually part of the Gradius canon. Konami later clarified that it definitely was not, but instead merely part of its inspiration and history. Graphically, the game would return to sprite-based graphics and utilize many of the usual Gradius staples. It would have 4 weapon loadout choices for its power-up bar: balanced, wide area, power, and air to ground. Just like in Gradius 4, players would only have 2 different barrier types to choose from: shield and force field. The title would consist of 8 stages, ranging from navigating the inside of a meteorite and maneuvering glass structures, to dodging oncoming crystal fragments and taking on hordes of Moai statues. Gradius Generation was a subtle nod to the arcade titles of the 1980s, while also maintaining its own identity. The game would launch in late 2001 overseas before releasing in Japan in early 2002. It would receive mostly positive reviews that praised its graphics and gameplay, and many forgave its lack of innovation due to it being a handheld title. After Gradius Generation, the series would remain on portable devices for its next 2 outings. In 2004, Japanese mobile phones received 2 new Gradius titles, Gradius NEO and Gradius NEO Imperial. They would both be relatively short experiences consisting of just 5 levels each, but introduced a few intriguing new concepts. Gradius NEO had a second bar next to the normal power-up menu that allowed the player to switch between 6 different types of option formations after collecting special green power-up capsules. It was a surprisingly forward-thinking idea, especially for an early mobile game, that sadly was never reused. Gradius NEO Imperial completely turned the series on its head by ditching the Big Viper entirely and instead giving players control of a rogue modified Big Core, the recurring boss found in nearly every Gradius game. The Big Core would need to navigate through 5 different stages and bosses, many of which were reused from Gradius NEO, and would utilize a power-up menu bar just like any other Gradius game. Similar to Gradius NEO, Imperial was a very interesting new take on the franchise, but sadly both experiences and their new ideas would be stranded on Japanese cell phones forever and quickly forgotten. Thankfully, the next title in the series would also introduce some fresh ideas. It would be outsourced to an external developer, though it would be one familiar with both Konami and the shoot-'em-up genre. In 2002, Konami decided to greenlight and begin development on Gradius' next mainline entry. However, their internal teams were all tied up with other projects, forcing the company to seek outside help from a developer they could trust with one of their oldest and most dear franchises. It would need to be someone who knew the ins and outs of the shoot-'em-up genre and was capable of putting out quality work. Luckily, a developer like this very much existed and was known as Treasure. Treasure had proven themselves with other fan-favorite shoot-'em-up titles like Ikaruga and Radiant Silvergun. Funnily enough, the company had been formed in 1992 by ex-Konami employees wanting to explore new and original ideas in their games without being stifled by Konami's reliance on repetitive ideas and sequels. This would be the first time the two companies had worked together since Treasure had split off and established itself a decade earlier. G-Rev, a developer that was recently formed by ex-employees of Taito's arcade division, would also assist in Gradius 5's creation. Konami would officially announce the game in early 2003, and development moved full speed ahead. The game was initially planned to release in both arcades and on Sony's PlayStation 2 console, but it became apparent that they would not have enough time to do both, and the arcade version was scrapped. Treasure had taken notice of the lack of innovation in some of the series' more recent titles, and wanted to approach this new chapter with some fresh ideas, coincidentally similar to why they had left Konami in the first place 10 years ago. While the team would make some changes, they still had to be careful not to do anything too outlandish to keep Konami, their contractor, happy. Probably the most notable change in Gradius 5 was the ability to now manipulate the Big Viper's options at will. By pressing the designated button, players can now aim, rotate, freeze, or form up their options depending on which type they chose. While it wasn't completely groundbreaking, it was a big step for a series that had not taken very many in a long time. Just like Gradius Generation, players were given 4 different types of loadouts to choose from. However, finishing the game unlocked an edit mode like the one found in Gradius 3. The title featured 8 beautiful stages that took advantage of the PlayStation 2's extra graphical power. Right off the bat, in the first stage, you would face off against the recurring original Gradius boss, the Big Core Mark I, as a normal enemy, and then weave through and destroy multiple versions of the Zealous Force, the final boss in the Salamander titles. The game sets the tone very early that it is much larger in scope than any of its predecessors. It also included not 1, but 2 boss parades featured in both the 2nd and 6th levels. Some of its stages certainly took nods from the previous Gradius titles, but also introduced some amusing new concepts, like having to dodge the physics-based deadly green acid in the Bacterian multiplication plant, and using large metallic boxes being knocked around to take cover from the attacks of the massive ground spider boss. Strangely absent from the game are the Moai statues that have been present in almost every single game in the franchise up to this point. Gradius 5 showed just how gorgeous and engaging the series could be when put in the right hands, and would finally make its debut on the PlayStation 2 in the summer of 2004. The game scored mostly positive reviews with critics, but it was becoming apparent the gaming horizon was starting to change as it was criticized for its challenging gameplay and lack of content and innovation. Still, it was a breath of fresh air for its fans, and many became excited to see what Konami might have in store for a potential Gradius 6. They wouldn't have to wait long though, as the game was announced the following year at the 2005 Tokyo Game Show as being in development for the upcoming PlayStation 3. Unfortunately, Gradius 6 never saw the light of day and was eventually cancelled for unknown reasons. Thankfully, Konami still had one more game left for its fans. but it would appear on an unlikely console, the Nintendo Wii. In 2008, Konami would contract Japanese developer M2 to create 3 games based off some of their most popular classic series for the Nintendo Wii's WiiWare downloadable service. M2 is probably known best for making amazing ports of retro titles for newer consoles. These 3 Konami games would not be standard ports, however, but instead reimaginings or remixes from their respective series. They would be branded as the ReBirth series and would include new entries for Contra, Castlevania, and surprisingly, Gradius. In fact, Gradius would be the first game in this new series to be developed and released. Gradius ReBirth would be on the shorter side, including only 5 different stages, and took almost all of its inspiration from the earlier Gradius games, with its main focus being on the series' MSX titles. It would include 5 different types of weapon loadouts to choose from and played very similar to most of the older Gradius games. It utilized a very similar weapon upgrade system to Gradius Gaiden, where certain weapons could be upgraded a second time by selecting them again on the power-up menu. The environments featured in Gradius ReBirth's levels included a wasteland filled with bones taken straight from the MSX and PC Engine Gradius ports, as well as the original Volcano stage, which included an interesting graphical twist depending on your actions. Its entire soundtrack would consist entirely of remixes from previous Gradius titles. The game launched in Japan in the fall of 2008 and later made its way overseas to North America and Europe the following year in 2009. It sadly received pretty mediocre reviews upon release. Reviewers praised its beautiful sprite-based graphics, but panned how short it was and were disappointed in its lack of innovation. While many of the previous Gradius arcade titles are still receiving re-releases and ports to this day, Gradius ReBirth would be the final original game in the series to be released, unless you want to count Konami's 2011 Gradius Patchy Slap machine. The series not only built up a large catalog of purely Gradius games, however, it would receive spin-off titles, cameo appearances, and even anime adaptations. The Gradius series on its own already had left a big mark in gaming history, but its impact goes far beyond just that of the main series. Many spin-off games were created as either parodies, tributes, or side stories. Probably the most popular and well-known of Gradius' spin-offs is the Parodius series. Its title is a portmanteau of the words parody and Gradius, both of which it greatly lives up to. The first Parodius game appeared on the MSX platform in 1988, but would expand out into 5 additional titles throughout the 1990s in arcades and on home consoles. These games would feature gameplay and a power-up system very similar to the regular Gradius titles. They would have very cute and silly graphics and included playable characters, bosses, and stages from various other popular Konami series. They also added in a bell power-up mechanic from Konami's popular Twin Bee shoot-'em-up arcade hit. While a few of the Parodius games made it over to Europe, the majority would remain exclusive to Japan. The final Parodius title, Para Wars, would see a release in 1997, but instead of being a shoot-'em-up, it would strangely be a turn-based strategy game. It was loosely based on 1989's Cosmic Wars for the Famicom, which featured the same type of gameplay and took place within the Gradius universe. The idea would be somewhat revisited in the tactical title Gradius Arc for Japanese mobile phones in 2010. The other spin-off series that managed to gain some popularity were the more recent Otomedius games, first released in 2007. Similar to Parodius, Otomedius is a portmanteau of Otome, meaning maiden in Japanese, and obviously Gradius. It featured space fighter ships from many of Konami's classic shoot-'em-up series, redesigned as females, and featured gameplay very similar to Gradius, with some small changes. The Otomedius series would have 2 separate games, with its second one, Otomedius Excellent, surprisingly making its way overseas to North America in 2011. In 1997, a 3D Gradius title would be released in arcades under the title Solar Assault. It would be a third-person on-rails shooter with gameplay similar to Star Fox or Panzer Dragoon. Just like the other Gradius games, it featured many of the normal staples like the power-up menu bar and recurring enemies and bosses. There would also be some strange titles like a puzzle game called Moai-kun that featured a cute version of the series' Moai enemy, and some cancelled projects like the Gradius racing game titled Vic Viper. Not only had the series received its fair share of spin-off titles, Gradius' music had been released in countless soundtracks and arrangement albums, and Salamander even received its own fully animated 3-part OVA series in 1998. The Vic Viper and other Gradius series alumni also made countless cameos in many of Konami's other games. Here's a few. Dance Dance Revolution, Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, YY World, Beat Mania, YY World 2, Contra 4, Poppin' Music, Zone of the Enders, The Second Runner, Air Force Delta Strike, Legend of the Mystical Ninja, Guitar Freaks, Elebits, Super Bomberman R, Monster Maulers, Castlevania Grimoire of Souls, Contra Rogue Corps, Konami Crazy Racers, Vandal Hearts 2, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Animaniacs, and Dead by Daylight. The Gradius series had many ups and many downs. It would push and challenge players in new and exciting ways, and helped evolve the arcade shoot-'em-up genre into becoming something greater. It gave up-and-coming developers like Castlevania's Koji Igarashi their start, and was a big inspiration to others like Bayonetta's Hideki Kamiya. Sadly, the longtime series had a tough time growing alongside a very erratic and ever-changing video game industry, but it left behind a legacy that can never truly be forgotten. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this series on the history of Gradius. I am a huge Gradius fan, so this one is very near and dear to my heart. I have a lot of Gradius games, a lot of Gradius merch. I've been into it for a long time. I love the series. I even have Gradius tattoo and a Moai tattoo. It's the only 2 video game tattoos I have. So yeah, huge fan, so this was a big one for me. This video series was supposed to be more of a general overview of the history of Gradius. Not really as much of a deep dive, more of a tip of the iceberg situation, if you will. Where I could have talked about a lot of different things. I could have made this video probably another 2 hours long, 3 hours longer if I had tried. Going into like level design, music, evolution of the Vic Viper's design. There's a ton of different things in there. I am going to provide some links in the description below, so I highly recommend checking those out. They go into more detail on some of the topics I did not in this, so definitely some required watching if you are a Gradius fan. I also want to give a big shout out to shmuplations.com. They are incredibly awesome, and their translated interviews were very helpful in me putting this video together. They have a ton of other interviews on there. They have a Patreon. Go support them. They are amazing. In terms of my favorite in this series, I would say Gradius Gaiden is easily my favorite. Gradius 2 probably a close second. And the most underrated is Gradius Galaxies, Generation, Advance, whichever region you're from, the Game Boy Advance one. Incredibly great game, amazing soundtrack. You should check it out if you haven't. Also, these games are out on modern consoles like PS4 and Switch, so I highly recommend you checking them out over there, support the series. Maybe one day Konami will grace us with the Gradius 6. I highly doubt it, but you never know. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go sleep for a week before I start working on my next video. Thank you so much again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.